Bam.
This is Sebastian Bae, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show, man. I appreciate it. I'm going to let Brad do the talking first because he is the guy that booked you, and I want to let him have his shot. So here we go.
Wow. So we know you from John Sullivan, who Pete and I know as a kind of big in the emergency management field. Would you say, Pete, or would you say more emergency response? He was a sheriff.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. But we know him from that, and I think I ran into you maybe 6 or 7 months ago. I have very fond memories of finding some SPI Wargames, Simulations Publications Inc. Wargames from the late 70s in my dad's collection of stuff from when I was 11 or 12 years old, and being absolutely wowed by them, having nobody who could understand how to play them, as friends, because I was just too young for that. And having filed it in my head as, one day I'm going to run into somebody who does this and makes these things, and I want to talk to him. If that
No, I definitely get it. So professional wargaming is one of those niche fields that not many people know about or do. And even in the DoD, where we're probably one of the biggest militaries in the world, right? There's probably only 100 of us that do this, right? And even fewer who do it really well, right? So it's a pretty niche field, and it can be broken down into largely education and analysis that I do both sides. But it's really interesting, and gaming has been growing in the last couple of years, both in the DoD and the wider government, and emergency response, healthcare policy. So professional gaming has lots of different dimensions and vectors to it.
Very cool.
Let me ask you. I want to
go. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to ask, when I think about gaming, not throughout my career, I've seen groups that do this. I know people that work in that training side of things, and they're trying to elicit, just different responses to what we're trying to get people out of the book. It's kind of how I read this thing, right? Like, what does the book say? The book says a company in defense does this, or whatever. And so the gaming creates new pathways of thought about how they might approach an age-old lock and block kind of approach. Is that a fair assumption of what happens when folks are doing this? And I'm talking like on their own, not guided by you or anybody professional, but just when they have the cards, the die, whatever it's going to be. What is the impact that they're trying to get?
So, like I mentioned before, gaming can be broadly broken down to two broad bins: analysis and education. Analysis is best characterized by the notion that you're trying to produce new insights, new data, and you're trying to usually feed it what we call a cycle of analysis, where you're trying to look at it in terms of a traditional study or models and simulations or some other analytical method on top of gaming, right? So often in that context, the players learn, right? But that is not the key objective. Often the key objective is that you really want highly expert subject matter, expertise in the room, so they can best emulate being a submarine commander or a nuclear deterrent person or a Japan expert and so forth. So you can sort of squeeze their knowledge all collectively together into this sort of cocktail of analysis and understanding. Because games are really about human decision making and consequences, right? So when we do analytical games about contingencies or looking at acquisition choices, you're trying to get the knowledge of the masses and squeeze it all together through the game and consequences and forced decisions where people have to live with them, right? So in some ways, yes, but in a lot of ways in analytical gaming, the players are the ingredients to the secret sauce, right? That the game sort of puts it all together. On the educational side and training side of the gaming house, what you said is absolutely valid, right? So a lot of times, whether it be in medicine or emergency response or even the DoD or the military, games for education are designed to have exploratory knowledge to give them context about there's no right answer in every decision, right? If someone asks a doctor's hey, when do you make this kind of call? Or if you ask a company commander, what is there an absolute answer for every sort of situation? The answer is always no. It's contextual, right? And this is why games are great, is because games are about fundamentally contextual decision making and exposing you to lots of different experiences. So even if you play hobby games for fun, right? So if Brad, you and me play a game, if you play the same game, it doesn't matter what game, right? We can play Risk, right? Every time we'll learn a little bit differently because Pete will adapt, Brad will adapt, I will adapt. We'll adapt to each other's little meta game about our personalities and so forth. Or if Brad like betrayed me, I will remember that for the next time we play, right? And that will like color my experience and the next time we have to make a deal, right? And those kind of contextual iterative learning is really the key to games because you know what I mean? If you have kids, right, you can always tell your kids like, hey, don't do this. I've done this. Don't do this. And they'll never listen to you because they haven't internalized that, right? Because people, in like psychology studies will show you like people are experiential creatures. They only really truly internalize things when they experience it, right? Whether that's a heartbreak or a bad decision, right? Or the stress or anxiety of making a time pressure decision. And games allow you to have a very synthetic experience of that, right? So you ever hear the term like, oh, the DoD fights the last war? It's not because DoD is dumb. It's because when you are faced with like time sensitive decisions, often you refer to your last experience, which is your last time when you were in combat, which is probably 20, 30 years ago, right? We don't have wars that often, right? So if your last combat experience was Vietnam when you're a captain and now you're a general, that's the experience you go back to, unless you have some other things that earmark that difference of to make the difference between missile age and counterinsurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan or Vietnam, right? So that's one of the reasons education through gaming is really important and really powerful for players.
One of the things I've noticed when you do games and gaming and military, and I'm using like the larger scale, war game type situation. Look, I'm a counterintelligence agent, and we often get written out of the game because we are a free radical in there. And all these, and you know this from being in the Marines. Everybody needs to go out and do the big movements. You have to put your truck, you have to put the trailer in the back, you have to haul that, piece of artillery out to the field on the mountain. You have to shoot the actual weapon, all these things that have to happen. And if you have a bunch of counterintelligence agents playing back and forth within your game and saying, hey, we found the bomber, that doesn't allow the entire division to do their part of the game. So one of the things we always struggled with was how do we remain relevant? And what would happen is and this is for everybody watching, like a lot of what we do is notional. It's not really happening. And so the person from our company who's in charge of writing scripts is writing scripts. And then we're interacting with that script. And then once they remove us from the game because we're too much of a free radical, we end up writing emails to each other on what we did. And we fuck around because it's like, oh, yeah, we found that guy too. It's like, oh, you didn't find that guy. All of this scripting, it takes... So we get no training benefit from this, right? And what we should be doing is sitting in cafes, having conversations and evaluating those or some other element of spying. Mm-hmm. So for us, how do you bring in there's a number of disciplines like this, but how do you account for that when you play a game? So you want to squeeze my information out of me and teach, because commanders they don't know how to drive a spy like they would like a TIC-13 or a MEU or whatever it is, right? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So when we often talk about the application of national power, right, that includes everything from intelligence to diplomacy to domestic politics, right, to the military. And it's often sometimes really hard to get all those organizations on the same page, but also really hard to create a training or even a war game experience that's relevant to everybody, right? Because the time scales are very different and the scopes are very different, right? Because what like a counterintelligence person or IC person, let's say NSA, CIA, any of the alphabet soup guys, right? The way they see the world and the way they should see the world is fundamentally different from a DoD person, right? It's that adage of like everything's a nail to a hammer, right? Is you have a bunch of screwdrivers, you have a hammer, you have a wedge, right?
Totally.
And everything in between. So there are very few things that require all those things, right? And even as a game designer, where I've designed exercises for like people out, right? Command post exercises. I've designed games and tabletops and digital games, right? And there are a bunch of constraints that come onto a designer. One is like what we call the meta, right? It's like the admin stuff, right? The funding, time. Like you can't lock. And sometimes I would love to lock my participants in a room and be like, we're going to play games for the next 20 days. right? And
Right.
I'm not gonna tell you when you're gonna leave. We're just gonna keep going until we solve the problem, right? Because you'll produce a very different game meta, right, for the players. Because sometimes when we say the game is Monday through Friday, right, that means that Friday turn is largely useless, right? That
Yeah.
Monday
Yeah.
turn is largely useless because the players are still learning, right? Only Tuesday and Thursday are really useful, right? um
Yeah.
so you know what I mean, there's a bunch of those elements to it that you have to balance. And sometimes we always ask, like, who's the primary training audience, who's the primary analytical audience, and then the other question is like, hey, like, how much are we abstracting to where, right? Are we focusing on the counterintelligence portion, right, and the other things are the background to it that is just necessary, or is it inverse, right, where the counterintelligence thing is just like the side thing and so forth? So it really depends, right, on the scope and how much you want to focus on either side, right? And there's no real perfect answer. This is one of the things that, like, young designers and my students at Georgetown always ask me as well. When I teach them game design, it's like, oh, what's the right balance? I was like, it depends. It depends on your sponsor, depends on your purpose, it depends on exactly what you want to do. So there's no perfect answer with it. And I think the real question sometimes is like, sometimes you have to narrow the scope. It's like, when is it the most powerful engagement between, let's say, counterintelligence and the IC element and the military portion? Like, when do those circles merge the most? And if you really want to focus on the interaction, that's where you want to focus and ignore everything else, right? And that means you won't be doing some other things that the military side needs. But if your goal is the interaction and the overlay, that's where you should sit, right? Versus, let's say, just layering it on top. But it
Let me
depends.
ask a follow-up to that, and then I'll let Brad go. Because of what we do in all of these things, but especially Intel, is it's vertical and it's really matrix. So I might be helping the PSYOP guys who are trying to figure out what messaging needs to go into an area, but I'm also communicating with the religious operation folks up at division. And then I'm also, so I've got this vertical horizontal stack of partners that I'm trying to impact within that game. And that's really what you'd want to teach someone like me, is how do you communicate up? How do you collect broadly for people? I call them the spaceship. The people who live in the spaceship have no idea what the ground truth is. And so when you write a report, they don't even know how to process it, because it's so foreign to them. Like, what do you mean our program for wells isn't working? That's impossible. All the reporting says the other, and so in a game, I'd want to be able to, like, help someone like me, or help someone who's going to have someone like me work for them, help them understand that. So how does the game take that aspect and say, we are going to narrow this down. We are going to teach commanders how to use, and senior NCOs, how to use Intel assets so that they can better drive that asset, improve their unit's performance.
So there are a couple of different ways off the top of my head I can think about doing that. Is one, you know what I mean, if you've been around the military, you've seen command post exercises, right? And command post exercises are fundamentally rehearsals for staffs, right, that run big operations, right? The two is like writing reports that feed the three, and operations that will plan operations, and then truncated versions and simplified versions. But they're really just emulating their jobs, right? You just playing, as I say, they're LARPing themselves, right?
Yeah.
In real time, right? They'll get sort of simulated responses from operations. They'll get intel reports and so forth. And there's a lot of volume, right? And so you're really trying to do that, right? So you can do the same thing, and just instead of the staff being the focus, you have the intelligence portion being the side, and you essentially simulate the rest of the ecosystem, right? So you can have them practice their job, right? Just like it's like a staff exercise. But that's more about the A's and the B's, right? Like, you're trying to go through the mental motions of learning how to do all those things and manage your time, and like, hey, what is our battle rhythm? What are the products? Who needs to get where? How do I practice writing these products and so forth, right? How do I practice briefing a CG or religious services and so forth, right? That's a different sort of like, command post or games for training sort of thing. Games for education is like, hey, I want a game. Let's say I want people to understand what Pete does, right? And you're like, or how this capability sits in the ecosystem of national power, right? Then you may say, hey, I want them to abstract away. I don't need them to learn how to write a report, right? To inform a CG or anything else. I want them to understand what my ecosystem does. Then maybe you have like a traditional board game, for example, you can say, hey, I have only so many meeples representing my counterintelligence guys, and each of them have a skill set that will give me certain types of intelligence, like commodities. So instead of, let's say, like collecting wood and sheep and like in Catan, right, you're collecting different types of intelligence. Then you're pushing that through like a pipeline, right, that is trying to inform decisions, right? So it affects about time and types of information and so forth. Like a colleague and I are working on a potential idea for like an IC game about like different intelligence agencies competing for information, right? And how each of them produce different types of intelligence, how that's also both cooperative and competitive at times. So that's sort of that notion, right? But I'm not teaching anyone how to be intel analysts. I'm just trying to have them understand how the intel community itself sort of works, so they can have a better understanding. So depends on what angle you look at the problem, right? So you're looking at the same thing just from different angles, just in those two approaches.
All right, Pete, looks like your battery is exhausted, so I'm gonna
press on, Brad. I got it. Go ahead.
I'm gonna press on. Yeah, I did watch a long form video with you demonstrating Littoral Commander Indo-Pacific for a gentleman. Don't remember quite when it was recorded, but you guys did almost an hour of showing off the product. And one of the things that I noticed is, sort of following up with what you said there, is there are technology cards, if you will. And it doesn't really matter if you really understand, like real deeply what the technology card does. It's that it does something. It's an abstraction for doing something. And you play it at the right time, or you use it at the right time, and you hope to get some effect out of it. And I think does that sort of, kind of define how you set these things up?
Yeah, so Littoral Commander was like this professional military educational game that I wanted to design for enlisted people to play with their officers, right? My vision for when I was designing it was that a captain in his company or battery or squadron would be like, hey, let's learn about the possible challenges of the future and think about how we interact cyber and drones and all these other stuff that we're seeing out in the world, because the world is changing real quick and real fast, right? And I wanted that sort of intersection, right, of officers leading these games for enlisted, so the enlisted understand, right? Because admittedly in the DoD, a lot of games are geared towards officers, right? Because they become senior leaders, they become generals. And I, as a former enlisted guy, as a former sergeant in the infantry in the Marine Corps, I wanted to produce something for the enlisted, the 90%, right? And the game has, if you're familiar with games, or if you're a hobby gamer, it is in many ways a very traditional hex encounter game, right? So you have military units and you move them around hex boards and you roll dice to shoot things, right? But there is this sort of Euro element of design where you have this card-driven mechanic that you mentioned, Brad, where they will select what we call joint capability cards, right? And they can represent everything from real-day, modern, current-day capabilities, like you can call for a bomber strike from a B-1 Lancer, right? You can call for cyber attacks from US Cybercom. You can do electronic warfare. And then there is a spectrum of stuff that is future oriented in the game, because it projects out into 2030 and beyond, of capabilities that the DoD, but also the PRC, who's the adversary in this hypothetical game, is experimenting with, discussing, because I would troll like news articles and they'll say, hey, China is experimenting with, like today I read an article how China is experimenting with these barges, right, to go into small ports in Taiwan, right? So, and I saved a link. I was like, oh man, that would be a cool card. Let's make that, right? Or the Marine Corps was experimenting with unmanned combat vehicles. They're like, hey, how can we attach unmanned combat vehicles, even a few years ago, to Marine Corps platoons to make them more lethal, right? Give them more firepower without increasing structure, right? And you see some of that happening in Ukraine with the Ukrainians and the Russians as well, right? And in a lot of ways, Ukraine is like a little hotbed of experimentation with FPVs, drones, fiber optic cables, trench lines are cool again, I guess, right? World War I style, right?
Right. They were literally dropping munitions from these drones, these just off-the-shelf drones, onto the turrets of tanks. Is what this is a new thing the Ukrainians invented. early on in their conflict. Crazy, but yeah.
Yeah. And they're each finding different ways. So like in those capability cards, two things I wanted them to do. One is to have an educational aspect where an enlisted Marine or sailor or airman will look at a card and not have known that capability and be like, oh, I know that's a DF-21, right? I know what that looks like now, right? And I sort of understand what it does. It's a big ballistic missile that goes really far and it's really bad for me, right? Right. And at the same time is to introduce them to new ideas and concepts of new technologies that don't exist yet, or at least not fully matured yet. And it's so in many ways, my publisher and I always call the game like a sandbox, right? We give you the bounds of the rules and we tell you like, hey, this is the bounds. But in many ways, the game is very flexible and it has a lot of flex in it where you can be like, if you're like Brad is like one day he's like, you know what, I've read this new article, let's make a card just for our set, right? And put on and post it. The game system, as long as you follow the core logic of the game, you can do it and be like, all right, how many dice does that give you, right? Should it succeed on 10%, 50%, 70%, right? Or be like, hey, this has increased my hit points, right? Gives me more things that can like have armor protection or something, right? So the game system is really designed to be adaptable in many ways and have them think about like, how do I use drones and is drones really useful, right? So like, for example, a colleague of mine asked me like, hey, what we see in Ukraine with FPV drones and these short range drones, are they useful in the Pacific? I'm like, yes and no, right? Because the Pacific is large, right? And Ukraine is different because it has internal supply lines and they consume, if you're not following, they consume like thousands of drones a month, right? And the tactics they're doing, right? And people are like, oh, we could do the same thing in Taiwan. I'm like, I don't know if you ever looked at a map recently. It's about 100 miles from China, right? And it's about like 1,000,000 times longer than that from the West Coast, right? So like supplying thousands of drones to an island under siege is probably much harder than it is for Ukraine, where we have Poland and surrounded by NATO countries, right? So like there are some things that can be learned and other things that just have to be adapted, right? It's not like you can throw a bunch of FPV drones that can only go 5 kilometers in the Pacific that have hundreds of nautical miles to cover, right? But at other times, those FPV drones may be really good on the beaches of Taiwan, right? If you can get them there, right? So if the Taiwanese buy a bunch of FPV drones, that's probably useful for them, right? But for the US, probably not so much, right? So these are the things, right? And even in Littoral Commander, I was running a session earlier today, was that like it comes with 4 maps: Taiwan, Okinawa, Luzon, which is the northern part of the Philippines, and the Straits of Malacca around Singapore. And one of the reasons I have 4 maps is because I wanted people to realize that a capability in one map, right? And let's say Luzon, right, that gives you the super long missile, let's say, right, is not as useful maybe in the Straits of Malacca when it's like a knife fight in a phone booth, right? You're like, hey, maybe I don't want 3 really long range shots. Maybe I want 15 really short range shots, right? So those are the real trade-offs that I want to have them to think about, where, hey, maybe I want unmanned boats in this area, but I want something very different in a different map in a different situation.
For a unit, a ship. In fact, we didn't mention this, but you actually fly out to some of these ships. Like I see you post pictures of this. You're like a real rock star with this. When you go out to, I mean, that's really cool because, not only do they get the game, but they get to see the guy who designed the game, and he's there and he's, kind of giving them guidance and, maybe even giving them tips, showing them around the thing, whatever else. How often do they train with the game? And let's call it training. It is typically a sanctioned exercise. How often do they train with your games, and how often do you think they should train with your games or games like that?
I think it depends, right? So the way I designed the game was, I always tell people, my game is your first intro to professional war game, right? It should be your first sort of introduction because it's designed to be accessible, it's designed to be simple. And there are certain things I purposely left out of the game because it was too complex or it made the game too chunky or too long, right? But the reason the way I say is like, hey, it is great for corporals and sergeants and staff sergeants to play with their younger Marines, but also great for your company grade officers, lieutenants and captains and majors, right? As they're in command and in leading young enlisted, men and women, right? And obviously it depends on the field. Like, for example, the game has a very fires and air defense focus, given the nature of the Pacific, right? And also the nature of the unit that it centers on, which is the Marine Littoral Regiment, which is designed for anti-ship, sensing, and sort of air defense, right? So if you're in those three fields, yeah, like the game is like custom made for you, right? If you're an engineer, it has some elements. There's like some engineering cards. Actually, I was doing this for an engineering battalion, and they're like, hey man, why are we only 3 cards in this game, right? And they were complaining. They're like, we do more than this, right? Which was, I was like, yeah man, I only have so many cards I can shove in this game, right? It's already like, it's quite heavy when you get it. I always say you can beat a small bear with the box when you get it. So I was like, hey, there's only so much space in this box. And my publisher was already mad at it. I put like 250 cards in this thing, right? So there's a bit of that, right? And so it depends on your field. But I think it's really great for a bunch of different communities to get together. And like if Pete is, let's say, engineer, and you're like an air warfare guy, and I'm like an infantry guy, it's a great way for us to all get to the table and bring our knowledge and share that knowledge of like, well, Pete will bring a different perspective than, let's say, a grunt like myself, and you, let's say, like an air defender, will think of very differently. And it's a way for us to now use the game as a medium for us to exchange our own knowledge, right? And it's like us having a conversation through actions, right? Because we have to collaborate. You will have discussions of like, Pete, I think what you did in turn 2 is stupid. Like, this is why I think it's stupid, right? And Pete is like, well, I think you're dumb. Or I'm like, yeah, you know what? I made a mistake, right? I didn't know any better, right? And that's honestly the favorite moments when I facilitate games, when there are a bunch of different services, communities, expertise, and even years of experience, right? At the table, because like sometimes my generation of the military, right? The guys I grew up with, or who are now majors and lieutenant colonels, sometimes we have a bias because our powerful experiential service was Iraq and Afghanistan, right? We never had to look up. We always joke, we never had to look up in Afghanistan, right? Because we owned the air, right? But these younger guys who don't have those kind of biases, right, baked into them from their experiences, they see Ukraine and they're like, oh yeah, we have to look up, right? And I think those are also important experiences, because sometimes having more experience is not always better. Sometimes you have experiences that bias you against clear answers that other people see. So I think it's great to have young people and more experienced people at the table. Also different, like I'll tell a quick anecdote. So there was an Army air defense guy. He ran, like, he did Patriot and THAAD. That's what his job was. And we're playing this game, and he's among a bunch of Marines guys, mostly infantry artillery guys. And when they were picking their cards, right, and they were reading the scenario, and he's like, I'm listening, and he's like, hey guys, I think we should get THAAD because the Chinese have lots of ballistic missiles, and this thing is the only thing capable of intercepting the ballistic missiles. And the infantry guys, we're like, oh, we're not worried too about it. We'll get a bunch of sires and we'll fire back. And he's trying to make his argument, and then he loses the argument, and then they start playing the game. And I think on turn 2, or like the end of turn 1, the Chinese team just unloads a bunch of these cards that are just ballistic missiles, and just like, hammers them. And I can see his face from across the room as I'm facilitating. He's just like, I told you guys. You can see on his face, like, and the first thing we did when we did our sort of after action report after the game was like, his hand shot up and he's like, hey, like, I want to talk about ballistic missile defense, right? And he gave this little spiel, and you can see these grunts understand, like, they internalize the experience of like, dude, I lost like a whole company's worth of people, right, to those cards, right? And that can mean a lot, right? That means 300 Marines that were just vaporized, right? From 1,000 kilometers and longer, right? And you can't touch those things, right? It's not like artillery, right? So their scale of perspective was expanding just from having that interaction, right? So that was, so those kind of things are really important. So I think people should game more, both in terms of like normal institutional curriculum, right, in the schoolhouses. But I am also a big advocate that people in any profession should do it regularly, in the sense, in the hobby game we call it beer and pretzel games, right? So you should have beer and pretzel games where you can drink beer and eat pretzels in the barracks and play this game, and still, you know what I mean, for a weekend when you're stuck on base because all your leave got revoked, right? Do something productive, right?
Yeah.
So
When
yeah.
when you talk about focusing on the cards on fires and everything, and that's just for people to understand, this is an offensive approach. It's an officer who is responsible for things leaving our area and going to that area to fight. I've been in units where the fires officer is completely obsolete because the fires that we're doing meetings, and it's not like they're in charge of like key leader engagement, right? And so they aren't equipped to think. This is not an artillery fight like in Iraq, mid stage, late stage, just not that many. Look, there are fire missions, right? But primarily the artillery guys are not doing that. So how do you put into there's so many things. I'm really big on, and I know it throws people off, but I'm big on affect over effect. And so, like, is there a card where it's like, by the way, your PSYOP messaging has failed, that hasn't moved the community at all, or whatever it is. These things that create failure in our system that allow us to lose wars, because I don't want to say anything bad about fires people, but just they're not licensed. They're not equipped to operate in the right environment. And so they don't know, like, hey, how do I lean on Pete and his team or whatever it is? So that kind of capacity, or the incapacity, or the lack of specific training, I always ask my friends who were like in the special forces, I'll ask them, have you fired more rounds in combat or had conversations? And the answer is always conversations. And one guy said he'd fired more rounds, one guy. And that's hard to represent maybe in a game, but you tell me, because you're the guy who does the game things. I'm probably wrong about this.
Yeah, I think it's also dependent, right? So, like, you know what I mean, having walked around the deserts of Iraq a couple times, I think the scale, like, if for example, like, if you look at the scale of artillery rounds we use in the 20 years of the GWAT, and the amount of artillery shells that the Ukrainians have used in their combat, astronomically different, right? And it's not because it's not like they're not using the similar processes that we are, right? We're teaching them in a lot of ways our processes, right? Is that it's just the volume has changed, right? Because in Iraq and Afghanistan, we were worried about collateral damage in a lot of ways, right? And you see in Ukraine, they're leveling cities, right? You see pictures of Kursk and stuff, and you're like, entire city blocks are just gone, right? After years of shelling and so forth, right? So I think there's a bit of a scale and character of the conflict that you're discussing and you're examining as well. But I think is also, and one of the things that the game tries to do, although it has a very strong kinetic fires like missiles, rockets, artillery shells, sort of focus and air defense is sort of counterpart. There is still what we call like the influence element, a cyber element, the non-kinetic electronic warfare element, right? So like one of my favorite parts of the game is this card called the tactical network card, which sort of sums up all the tactical networks like Link 16, Link 11, AFATIDS, and all this stuff that allows you to communicate, right, and move data around for targeting. And for example, like Brad can play a cyber card that like degrades my network, which will affect my ability to fire, right, effectively. So it may turn something from a 14 and below on a D20 down to a 10 and below, right? I can still shoot, but I'm getting worse data, bad intel, whatever that may be. There are also cards.
Oh, D20 being a 20-sided die for anybody who's not quite up with it.
Yeah, exactly. And we do have like an influence mechanic in the game where like some of the scenarios have like an influence dynamic where you win in different ways, where you can achieve a smaller military victory, but as long as you have a bigger, or let's say a sizable like influence victory, you can win that way too, right? And so there are different ways, and there's also like collateral damage games, scenarios. There's a mechanic in the game where like you can add civilians onto the map, and they will just like randomly move and like get in your way, and that's your own sort of consideration as well, right? So the game is supposed to make you think about all those sort of multiple dimensions, and at least in
that's
some
great.
way, right? And one of the things that in the first version of the game I regret not being able to do more of was the influence portion. A lot of the influence cards were sort of repetitive. They sort of stuck with the same structure without engaging with each other. So, for example, like you said, like with the second edition that I'm working on right now that will come out later in this year, I'm trying to get the influence cards to like pair up with each other, right? Like, for example, if I'm able to do, let's say like sort of, let's say human intelligence network, right? Let's say I play that card, right? And I can move the influence meter, right? But then if I play, let's say, proxy forces, right? Maybe that the proxy forces card will be more successful because I played that card before, right? Say, hey, if you play this card in the same turn or in the same, you know what I mean, sort of like sequence, and you play that successfully, your chances of getting proxy forces better, right? Because you sort of seeded the ground, right? So we wanted those kind of interactions more. And it's a little bit harder because, you know what I mean, the human dimension, the influence dimension is harder to quantify, right? Like with missiles, you can look at technical data and stuff like that, and craters and CPs, circular error probability, and so forth. But with humans and influence, it's much harder. But that's something we're trying to do more of in the game in terms of follow-on stuff. And we're still adding new cards and adapting new cards for the new edition because things have changed, right? Things have gotten more interesting, and sometimes there's more information out there, right? Like a lot of stuff with unmanned systems in Ukraine, and it has been really interesting to read out in the news and so forth.
It's like it's infinite what you could blossom off of something. Like I could drop my forced parliamentary election card on you, and you're like, oh fuck, you know, we're switching parties.
No. It's funny that you mentioned that. So like, just to get our players to understand how sometimes the outer world beyond their tactical little, what I call the tactical well, can affect them. And some of we have event cards, right? And the event cards are sort of scripted into the scenario sometimes in terms of like, play this event card possibly on turn 3, or like, hey, this event card is in effect, right? So for example, in one of the scenarios, we'll say like, on turn 3, roll a dice. If it's odd numbers, monsoon is in effect, right? So monsoon in the Indo-Pacific can essentially ground all air. So they'll say like, hey, if you have played any air cards in your hand, if there are any on the map that you've used, get rid of them. They're not flying anymore, right? They're gone, right? And to your political card, there's one card that's sort of nasty as an event card, which is it said in the Indo-Pacific version, it says like the DPRK, North Korea, is doing some sable rattling, and there's another crisis in Korea. Discard half of your cards, right? And you don't get them they're just going to Korea. They're just gone now, right? But you still have to fight the scenario, you still have to win, right? So that's one of the ways we try to get some of that. And it's none of your in your control, right? And sometimes you just use them as aids, or just making them think like, hey, there are things beyond your tactical well that will affect what happens inside of it. And yes, you should make sure you know how to swim and operate in that well, but understand that some forces will just reach into your well and really affect you in a different way.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love it.
Pete and I have a friend who we wish was here with us. George, he passed a few months ago, and he was an emergency management guy, and he would tell some great stories, like how way back in the day, the state of California, he was sort of way up at the top of the EM for the state of California under Gray Davis, way back when. State of California had a mutual aid relation with NASA, which would allow them to use U-2s out of Moffett Field. And it turned out that George discovered that the U-2s hadn't been there for 10 years. Sometimes in emergency management exercises, when you do an exercise, you'll do things like test radio equipment, test, we got these LA fires going right now just to the north of Pete and I, test out your water supply. Turns out maybe they didn't do that last week. You do those kinds of things, which you're depending on, and you do those regularly. And one of the points of the exercises is to point out shortfalls that you need to backfill. Do you have a way to get that kind of a thing into your games?
Yeah. So in a lot of ways. So one of the things what we call like sort of the Littoral commander sort of does that in some ways, but in broadly speaking, what you do for a lot of games, for a lot of training education, you want to do like the most likely scenario, right? That's what
Mhm.
you want, because you want to train people on like that 85% of things that will happen most times, right?
Mhm.
Right. Using the LA fires and the troubles right now in California with the fires, the wind-driven fires in LA are not the 85%. They're like the 1%, right? Like the
Yeah.
convergence of a bunch of bad things happening all at once, right? Um, and that is not what you train to, right? You train towards the 85%, right? But at the same time, sometimes we do games where you do multiple scenarios, what we call sort of like um, games across the bell curve, right? So you do that sort of everything in the standard deviation under the curve. Then you do some things that are really radically different, right? In either
Mhm.
direction, right? Whether you're like, hey, what happens if we have to put out fires from a nuclear explosion or a wind-driven firestorm like this, right? Or maybe like, hey, what happens when something else happens, and all these sort of things, and you're like, hey, what are absolute edge cases of worst case scenarios that we need to start thinking about, right? And that's
Right.
how you often always, because often things like your any system, right, whether it be a company or a fire department or public infrastructure, they're mainly designed to accommodate the 90-85% of stuff, right? So if this was a normal wildfire in California wildfires happen, and it would have been done, right? Like the system is designed to do that, right? When you're facing like hundreds of thousands of acres of fires that are just blowing faster than you can put them out, there's not enough water in California, right? In a lot of ways that you can get into those places, right? So the idea is like, hey, how do we think about these, right? And for example, you can be like, hey, could we use planes? Could we use seaplanes and pick up seawater, right? But that
Mhm.
requires infrastructure and plans. And you're like, and a lot of times also, if you're a city administrator, you have to make choices, right? You're like, hey, is preparing for the worst 10% chance that something happens worth the $3 billion a year that I have to pay just to make sure I'm prepared for that, right? And sometimes those are choices, right? That's why we have elections and all these propositions in California to discuss those things, right? Um, and I think that those are also the big questions, right? Of what, because being prepared for a lot of things requires, and it's like your physical health, right? It's all those checkups, right? Those preventative stuff that you put in, like going to the gym and all those things that help you prevent all those long-term problems later on, that are more acute, right? So I think those are the challenges, and we do games a lot about that. It's like, hey, what is the structure you need for a fire department to manage all these crises, right? We do this for the DoD as well. We're like, because the DoD can't be built for every problem, right?
No, and you really don't want the DoD solving every problem every day.
Yeah.
I mean, they
Yeah.
need to have training time too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And even in military contexts, right? You have to make trade-offs, right?
Mhm.
Are we building a military to fight peer competitors, right? Which are big missiles, big ships and stuff? Are we preparing a military for counterinsurgency? Are we preparing
Right.
for crisis response, right? Are we doing humanitarian disaster relief, all this stuff, right? So how big, how heavy, what I mean, sort of, and those are all what we call force design questions, right?
Mhm.
And we'll do games like that as well, where we'll get the service sort of high service leadership, and we'll like, hey, we're going to run your different ideas. So we have 3 different ideas of what the, let's say, in the Navy looks like, right? Different ship compositions and different types of personnel and manning and different capabilities, and we'll run them through all 4 different scenarios, right? All 4 different types, and we'll sort of grade them as we go, right? And see where are the strengths, right? And then none of them will pass all 4, right? It's nearly impossible, right? Because they're so divergent, right? But the real question is like, hey, which are the scenarios that I care about? And then that's usually the ones I grade heavier and weight them towards the thing I'm trying to look at, right? So that's a bit of it, and same thing with fire departments or even education or healthcare and so forth. So that's really the challenge.
Yeah. So I want to steer you a little bit different direction, for the last 15 minutes of this. And I have this pet theory, and it's, I'm in my mid 50s. I've been doing computer IT stuff, original products and whatever else for 35 years. One of the things I notice is any little company, any medium-sized company, any big company will get into emergency mode way too often. And usually they get into an emergency mode because they didn't think about the thing that tripped the emergency mode. And so one of the funny things I've been thinking about for quite a while is, instead of coming to us with plans about how you're going to respond to an incident or whatever else and developing all these plans, let's go and make one and see what happens. Let's do that repeatedly. I mean, I've been involved with many businesses where, we would have something that would bring down our system, or we would get attacked, on the internet or something like that. And while we responded to it, and everybody worked real hard to get the response right, we never went back and said, hey, what are our vulnerabilities here? What else could bring us down? What could we test and see? Is this going to be a problem? And then go fix it then, rather than when it becomes a problem live and we really we're on the hot seat to fix it. And I wonder what your thoughts are, kind of about adapting gaming in order to do that as like a routine business process.
Yeah, so there's actually a sub niche in the professional gaming field. Like DoD is probably one of the biggest ones because of just how big the DoD is and how wargaming sort of originated in the military, the Prussian military. But there's a sub niche that is small but still growing a little bit on the business side, on this looking at what they call business gaming, or what they call crisis gaming, right? Where it describes many of the things. So like one of the early adopters were banks, right? So you probably heard like when they will hire like former thieves or professionals to try to like test their security, sort of like red teaming or physical security. And that was a little bit different, but like that led to like, hey, let's run ourselves through a crisis, right? Like a simulated crisis. So they'll hire companies to essentially like a command post exercise for a military, run them through a crisis. And let's say, Pete, you're the CEO, Brad, you're the CIO, right? And we'll run you through a crisis that's like a public, let's say, it can be a recall of a product, or like, your product is, there's some kind of scandal, whatever. And the next 4 or 5 days, I'm going to give you information as of like press releases and information from your engineers, and it like simulate that world. And all of you are trying to make decisions. You're like, hey, I don't know what is our risk, and I'll give you daily updates about your stock prices, right? Because that'll affect your decision making and so forth. And I'll give you like headlines from the New York Times articles or that are fake and stuff, to sort of feed this sort of experience of like, hey, what does it feel like to be under that crunch, right? Other times, other institutions have looked at it for proactive things. So like, if I'm trying to break into a market or try to launch a new product, they'll sort of do this sort of simulations, business simulations, to work through their staff of like how they would think about problems, right? And that's one way to do it, right? And it's a very small niche. Only a few companies really do it. There's a growing bit of literature about it, which is interesting. And they adapt some of the things we do on the military side, on the government side as well. And just for different contexts, right? So they don't care so much about missiles and things. It's about like press briefings and processes and compliance and all those other things, and so forth. Like, because there are trade-offs too, right? Because there are things that you can do publicly to, let's say, calm the let's say you have a 1%, like let's say you have a recall of like one batch of bad product, right? But that may have astronomical effects on your stock prices as a company or your reputation, right? Depending on how you handle it, right? So like there are a bunch of different things that sort of coalesce and converge as a company that you have to deal with, especially with the speed of information you're doing now, right? So there's a lot of that, and that field is very small, but it is growing. And sometimes I'm like, oh man, I'm doing the wrong side of this gaming, having seen what they get paid on the other side, outside the public sector. So maybe I'll do that in a few years.
Hey, one of the things you mentioned I thought was really interesting is, while you're running this as a game, and while time is really, really crunched, you need fast responses and fast decisions. You also mentioned at the beginning, I'll send them a note every morning. Like, this is a multi-day exercise that maybe takes 10, 20 minutes of their time each day. But the time is also expanded as well, to take into account something like, hey, a stock market drop, that there's there's a little bit of a delay based on what your decision is, and there's time that is going to take the markets and your customers and whoever else to absorb your decisions and decide what they're going to do. And I'd assume you facilitating this, you're taking the time to do that. That's a very interesting way to run that I noticed that you spelled out.
Yeah, so sometimes our professional games take very different formats than like hobby games, right? Like hobby games like Littoral Commander, which sort of sits at that intersection of hobby games and professional games. It's like a tabletop. We sit around 4 hours and we'll play the game, we finish it, we'll talk about it. Those are some games, and a good chunk of them. Sometimes we have done distributive games where everyone, like we all just meet for a morning every quarter, right? So the game itself is multi-turn, right? But we only play for half a morning or like a morning every like 3 or 4 months. And in the meantime, I'll generate as the game designer. Like you guys will make a decision. I give you a bunch of information. You guys have your board meeting or whatever, and you make a decision. And then I'll go back and like adjudicate. And then the next time we'll meet and we'll do it, right? And sometimes it's really interesting because like the little things will affect it, right? Like one time, like there'll be a person missing because they're in like a different time zone, right? So the one person we needed wasn't in the call, or the players needed wasn't in the call. He was supposed to be, wasn't in the call, and they just made a bad decision because they're like, oh, we have to make a decision, we have to do something. So they did something bad, right? And the other guy gets on a call 3 months from now. He's like, what the hell, right? You're like, well, you weren't here. I was like, well, I was doing other things. I'm like, well, and he's like, oh, this is the game is broken. I'm like, no, like that's what happens in real life too sometimes, right? Like you have to move, and sometimes not everyone gets on the train, right? So there's a bit of that. Other times we'll do multi-day games, right? Where, for example, let's say we're doing a company size game, right? Like where you're like a corporation, right? Let's say, Brad, you're the CEO. You may only come in for the first hour to hear what's happening and give out direction. And Pete and I are your sort of like your managers, your supervisors. And we may be churning on like all of our guys for the rest of the day, for the 8 hours in the day, submit our actions to the adjudicators. And let's say like I'm adjudicating overnight. And then the next morning, Brad just walks in again. He's been told by the adjudicators what happens, and he's like, Pete, what happened? That's not what I wanted. And Pete's like, that's what happened, right? And then we just repeat that for like 4 or 5 days, right? So that's a process itself, because that one is looking at sort of multi-level, like not only decision making but also actions, right? Because Pete has to hear what you're saying and then translate that to actions. And like you may say, hey, I want to manage the PR problem, right? And that might be your direction as the CEO. And Pete's like, what the fuck does that mean, right? So now he has to tell his guys, is like, hey, my PR guys, I want you to think about this, gin up some statements, do this, do that, blah, 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 right? And so forth, right? So there's sometimes depending on what element of the problem you're trying to address, right? Same thing in the military. Like sometimes I have games where the general or admiral only shows up for an hour of a day, right? Because they're busy schedules, and they're like, hey, I'm gonna show up to make the decision. Your colonels and lieutenant colonels and majors will churn on slides and produce plans and things for 8 hours or 9 hours. Be adjudicated, and he'll walk in again. He's like, hey, all right, what's happened, right? Kind of thing. And in a lot of ways, those represent their own sort of battle rhythm as well.
Mm-hmm. So what you're kind of doing is you're almost developing a capability within a company, and you're doing it, in sort of a group exercise, and then dry running it, testing it, seeing when you have that capability developed and the CEO likes it. And then that you could go live with it with a real, situation at some point in the future. Maybe you need to continue to train with that in order to, develop it more, or keep the skill up to date, or whatever else. I mean, it sounds like things companies ought to be doing anyway. Yeah. And you can make it organized and fun.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like a colleague of mine who works in the Netherlands, right? He does a little bit of corporate gaming, and he was telling me about how you did a game for a milk company, right? Like a big corporation that does like milk and dairy products in the Netherlands. And he's like, hey, we did this whole response game about what happens if they have tainted milk, right? right? Like, how does the company respond, right? Like, what is our processes, right? And they're like, yeah, they had a plan on paper, but they didn't really understand what that meant, right? In a lot of ways, right? And then also like,
Right.
who read the plan or about the tainted milk protocol, right? Kind of thing, right? Um, so he ran this game for this milk company and their executives of like, what happens if your company like gets responded like there's tainted milk or whatever, right? What do you do? And they were like, they had a plan. They were so flabbergasted and they made all these poor decisions in crisis, right? And that were suboptimal. And sometimes they were also surprised by like the backlash that the game represented. Like they had like these like bad social media posts that were being posted, and they're like, oh shit, like we had to worry about this or kind of thing, right? And there was and it made them think about the problem in a broad sense, right? And gives that experience, right? So that was like, you know what I mean? Gaming's not wargaming in a lot of ways is the most dominant form in a lot of ways,
Sure.
but it can be applied to a lot of things. Like, and that was really, and I tell that story to my students, also to my young analysts at work, because I'm like, hey,
Mm.
what we do can be applied in a lot of contexts as long as it's about decisions and
Mhm.
you know what I mean, some kind of abstraction and consequences, right? The
Mhm.
consequences portion is really important, right? Where I'm making a decision and I have to have some kind of consequence that feeds back information to me, right? So I can make the next decision, right? And the idea is like, hey, how do I correct the plan when something goes wrong, right? Because that's what games are really about, is like, how do I adapt to new inputs and
Mhm.
new information, but also uncertainty sometimes, right? Because you know, what I mean, if you ever run a business or if you ever um, been in a situation like in the military or anything else, right? There's always times that you have to make a decision sometimes with uncertain information, and that's also a big portion of gaming.
Yeah, you're giving
Yeah.
people reps is what you're doing. You know, it's
Yeah,
like reps are super important. You know, you can, who am I thinking of, Pete? 10,000, Steve Pinker, not Steve Pinker. It's the other guy.
Malcolm Gladwell.
Malcolm
Malcolm
Gladwell.
Gladwell.
Yeah.
the 10,000 hours,
Yeah.
right?
10,000
Right.
hours, you know, however
Yeah.
many reps it takes or whatever to, that those are very, very important. And, you know, hopefully, you know, you continually do those so that
Yeah.
you're ready for the real situations when they come up and they don't scare you too much.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So one of my little taglines when I give my whole briefing on games to people is, especially for educational games, is educational games is the same thing as physical training or PT in the military, right? We
Nice.
all wake up in the morning at, you know what I mean, before the sun gets up and run 5 miles, 6 miles. We carry packs and go on long hikes. We go to the shooting range, mainly because one day we will have to do all those things, right? We have to carry
Mhm.
someone heavy on our backs, run for a really long time, have that physical endurance, and that requires regular exercise, right, for our bodies, right? In
Well,
the
that's
same
certainly
way,
part of the
yeah.
mission.
Yeah. And in the
Yeah.
same way, I tell people, hey, in the same way, we have to practice our minds and our decision making because our minds are our first weapons of how we use our bodies and everything else. Right. And that way, games, how when we exercise decision making, when that's when we get our reps and sets, right, at making decisions, right?
Yeah.
Because you know what I mean, that's, you know what I mean, no one teaches you how to be a CEO, right, for every situation, right? You're built on experience, but you're then also constrained by your experiences, right? So
Mhm.
if you ever encounter something that's never happened, right, that's a problem, right? So that's games and synthetic experiences. That's why also doctors practice, right, before they do different surgeries, right? Right. And that's the idea, is like, how do I respond to different situations under pressure, under stress, anxiety? And games are a way to build those, what I call like synthetic chapters in your book of experiences, right? Of like,
Mm.
hey, I'm adding experiences where I can refer back to one day, right? So it's not just the experiences in which I experience in my own career.
Right. Fortune 500. How many, what percent do you think regularly do some sort of gaming exercise at the C-suite level?
Oh man, I don't even know. That's well beyond my knowledge. I talked to some of the corporate guys at some of our conferences and we work together, but that's not a field that, or not a number I can confidently tell you.
You don't even,
But
you don't have a sense of it, like maybe like
yeah,
1%, 10%. It's very common. Is it,
I would
you don't
say,
even know?
yeah, I wouldn't even know. But my
Okay.
guess would be, my uninformed guess from our conversations and a lot of stuff would be probably like 20%, right? Would
Okay.
be the right number, mainly because it takes time and takes money, right?
Mhm.
And even for the DoD, sometimes it's hard to convince people to pay the money for the experience if if they don't know what they're buying, right? So a lot of
Mhm.
times you have to explain the value of the training, right? Because you're like, if you're trying to convince a CEO who's already a busy day, you're like, hey, why do I need to practice running a company when I do it every day, right? Because, well, have you practiced tainted milk, or have you practiced this
Right.
situation, right? Same thing with fire departments and emergency management, right? Is like, hey, how do I make them think about situations where they may have atypical experience, right? That I'm trying to prepare and
Mm.
get their minds ready for, right? And like, for example, FEMA, we did a series of games for FEMA looking at hurricane response, right? And that was an easy sell for them because they're like, hurricanes come all the time, right? And we want to
Yeah.
we want a means to train our young guys to understand how FEMA responds nationally and how it supports things, right? And a lot of people, there are misconceptions about FEMA, about like what FEMA does. Like, people think FEMA puts on helmets and like digs, you know, what I mean, your trenches and water lines. FEMA's often like a coordinator, right, for local
Yeah.
services to make sure they
Right.
have. It's the local folks who do all the actual like legwork, but it's FEMA's the one that brings money to buy big purchases of water or shovels or sand or whatever. And that's what they're trying to get the FEMA folks to understand, is like, where do I go to, right? And every state is different. Like, the person you go for X may be very different from North Carolina than it is in Florida, right? Because states have different processes, right? And they're trying to teach them that, right, before they
One
get on the
thing,
ground. Yeah.
one thing I wanted to get into before we wrap this up too is there's a book in the there's a school of military high end things, and it's called SAMS for everybody who doesn't know it. Just, you can look up their reading list, and one of the books in there, they talk about doing a study with people, and they give them like a problem, like you've got an African village and you have to get these people fed and teach them how to farm. And what happens is like the gaming subject gets driven crazy, right? It's like a human uh, like default, where like, I don't know, turning the knob to 6 didn't work, turning the knob to 4 didn't work. I'm just going to bang it all the way to 12 on this side and all the way to -2. And they just get to these careening decisions really fast. And that was sort of the point of the game, is to show your fallibility, show your mistakes you're making. And that, because we don't like slow progress or even slow degrade. And, understanding, like, we want to fix the problem, but problems are often fixable at that rate. Is that something that you see where, like, you can guide them, like, hey, you're starting to bang the switches around a little too hard, let this thing, see if this passes? Or how do you deal with that human nature, I don't know, denominator that we have, where
Oh
we
yeah.
go crazy?
I think in a lot of ways, when we think about being a game designer, you always have to think about a lot about the human dimension of like the player, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes I always tell my designers, like, sometimes you have to lean into the boredom, right? Or the long timelines or the long payoff, right? Like,
Mhm.
influence gaming or intelligence, right? Like, if you're doing a game about intelligence cultivation and like and stuff, like, it may take you years to get
Yeah.
access to the thing that you want, right? You have to play a very long game of back and forth and so forth, right? Identifying the right person, identifying the right intelligence. Do they have the right access? Convincing them they should share it with you, whatever, all this stuff, right? There's a great Cold War game about stuff like that, where you're like cultivating like intelligence assets during the Cold War, right? But the payoff is like not until turns 3, 4, 5 if you play something in turn 1, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes you have to just lean into that, right? And just like, there are some turns that are just, you'll be waiting, right? Just to be like, I don't know what's going on, right? I shot a bunch of things down the pipeline. I don't know what's gonna come out, but you know what I mean. You know what I mean. Sometimes, and the hard part is sometimes when you start banging the switches, it's hard to understand. Was it the first switch that I did, or was it
Right.
the other switch that I did recently, right? And I think that's the hard part for sometimes for us to, as players and as humans, to resist the urge, right, of like
Yeah.
constant try and change and be like. And also, some game systems are really clever in that way, that where they'll have sort of exponential growth on the back end, right? So you'll have a
Mm.
very linear, slow like response, and then it'll have like explosive growth, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
and it depends on the kind of feedback system that you're having in your game, that is interesting, right? So
Yeah.
that's always a thought. Or like other portions is like where we have games where players will plan their moves, plan ahead, right? So like if you ever play Axis and Allies, this is one of my perfect examples, right? So Axis and Allies as a commercial game has a really clever little thing for easy game where you have to buy all your stuff that you want to buy in the first move, in the first step, before you do combat, before you do before you know any situation of your plan, right? So you have to make a decision of what you're going to build at the end of the turn, right? So you may be like, hey, I'm going to build a bunch of ships because I have this plan. We're going to do this whole like beat the Japanese in the Pacific kind of thing, and then you suffer terrible like infantry losses in China, right, fighting the Japanese, and at the end the ships are still being built, even though right now you're like, oh, if I could choose right now, I would choose to build infantry. But the thing is that it forces you in the pure sequence of a game to just make a decision early on before you have that information. And then if you're going to buy infantry, you got to have wait until the next turn, and those guys won't pop out until the end, right? So there's like a delay that's really important for that kind of grand strategic level, that is just done in a simple way. But if you move that a simple decision down, you have a lot more information, but it's not realistic, right? Like they just magically all of a sudden appear, right? You're like, oh, that's going to take me a year to raise a division that I lost in Manchuria, right? And so forth, right? So there's a little bit of that.
When I used to work at a source school in the Army, and I've written a couple exercises since then. But when I write them, and I'm writing for intel people primarily, people who are working on the non-lethal side, I don't write a solution. So when we get to index, sure, we know it Friday after. Index is the end of the exercise, everybody. When you get to index, like, oh, it's 4:20, on a Friday, like we're about to call index. It's going to happen. So I don't like to build that in there. So I just build characters, and they're forced to interact with them. And then when we do like the nightly briefing with the DCO, they'll have all these wild conclusions, and I'll say none of that is accurate. And they lose their minds because they think that they're trying to resolve something by the end of the week, but deployments don't work like that. And so I'm like, you don't know anything yet. I'm telling you right now, I'm the DCO. I've been here. I know all the characters. And then they'll break the game, the fourth wall of the game. That you're not giving us enough stuff, Pete. This is not fair. And I'm like, I don't know who Pete is. I'm the DCO. I'm telling you, you're wrong about whatever that village is. You don't know. So go back and talk to another person and write another report and slowly build your knowledge, because you cannot figure this out on game or turn 3. And I love that what you're talking about, where you lean into that monotony, because it is a lot of Groundhog Daying when you go to combat. Even if you're going on patrols and getting blown up every day, there's still that. Is it Tuesday? You only know because the chow hall is serving tacos, or Thursday night is the spaghetti night. And that's how you know what day it is, even if it's kinetic as fuck, because that's reality. And I love my exercises that I write to have that element where you just not even have blind alleys, just the character just disappears from your world and you don't get a chance to engage them again, because that is how it goes in the real world.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a lot of ways, sometimes like in games or in command post exercises like that, you want to, like, I did a exercise way back in the day where we created all these like sources for human intelligence to feed the two shop, right? And we'll give them a bunch of reports, right? And sometimes we will plant a report, right? So we would have it scripted already, right? That's like that they don't know, like this person is lying, right? But they are saying all the right things in the report that the two wants to hear. Right, we know the two wants to hear this, right? So we give it to him, and he sees it, and he's like, "Oh, this is exactly what I want," right? Right? But what we want him to learn is, right, is to vet it, right? It's like, okay, we should probably ask somebody else, see if this information is true, versus just believing it because I want to hear this and I have been self-validated, right?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Because one of the things we want to teach is like, hey, sometimes the locals will know what you want to hear, right? And they'll use you, right? Right, to do the thing they want you to do because they know the words that will get you to do the thing they want, right? Or be like, yeah, that guy's selling pop. He has poppy, plants up there, but he may be just a rival farmer that is doing whatever. And it's like, yeah, he's definitely Taliban, right? Whatever, right? And so forth. And I think that's the things you're trying. And I always tell them is like, hey, we're not trying to teach you the answer of this person is bad or this person's bad in the scenario. We're trying to make you understand techniques of like do vetting. This is how also like you should probably also like confirm these intelligence, right, in different ways, right, before you do big moves, right? Like there was in that same exercise, the air wing was really upset because they got hit by man pads. They're like, oh, we're never told there were man pads in this area when these helicopters got blown up. And then we're like, oh, and they started complaining to me as the white cell. And I was like, okay, let's walk over. And we walk over to the 2 shop, and I was like, hey, 2, like, give us your intel briefs for the last like 3 days. Right. And it's like a 2-week exercise. And we're like pulling out the intel reports. And I was like, hey, where's the man pad assessment? And he's like, oh, it's over there. And it looks on it. It's like a man pad thing. And he's like, where did this report go? And he's like, so went to the 3. And the 3 is like, oh yeah, it's sitting over there in the corner that this lieutenant is working on. And never got to the air wing guys who were doing their missions and all this stuff, right? I was like, dude, the information was there. It's not cheating. We're like, it was there. Yeah. I gave you the chance to like not run into man pads and to get shot down. But you know what I mean? This is a learning lesson, right? Is that maybe you should go confirm with the 2 and the 3 that with intelligence, the 2 and 3, the operations guys, that you have the best information of just assuming you're like, oh, they should have told me, right? Kind of thing. And those are sometimes those also similar kind of lessons.
Yeah. No GNUs is good GNUs from Gary.
Yeah.
I don't want to take any more time. It's Friday. It's late and everything else. I don't know if Brad has anything he wants to close with, but I am good. Thank you very much. When you guys wrap up.
Yeah, I'm good as well. This is absolutely fascinating. Look, there's not a lot of people I wish I could trade places with. But what you do, and you can't have a day that's just not fun. I mean, and if you did, you just find a way to make it fun.
Yeah.
Right.
No. Yeah. It's definitely been a blessing in many ways, and I really love the career I have doing professional games, especially doing stuff for like the government and a lot of public service. In my way, I see it a lot of extension of my time in the Marine Corps, right? Just serving in a different way outside of uniform. So, and I get to play games, build games, and one of my favorite parts of the career is being able to tackle problems and the wicked problems of different fields. Like when I first designed a FEMA game, I knew nothing about hurricane response, right? But one of my first things designing that game was to learn about hurricane response, talk to all the smart people who've done hurricane responses, and be like, hey, what are all the things that, like, I'll be like, hey, this is how I see your doctrine or your papers have told me hurricane response is supposed to work. And I'll sit down with a bunch of like guys, and they're like, yeah, that's how it's supposed to work in theory, right? But let me tell you how the real works. So, like, this line doesn't exist, and sometimes this line exists, and sort of and that's really how we try to represent the game. Like, sometimes the system breaks down, right, under enough pressure, and it'll start shifting, and that's what we tried to. And it's really, for me as a avid learner, I always say I'm a student of life, right? I love learning things, and that's why I love designing games, because I get to learn about a bunch of different things, from hurricane response to healthcare policy and to like contingency response in the military. So I get to be this big sponge a lot of times and just learn, which is a lot of fun, honestly.
Yeah, that's cool. Let me wrap this thing up, and then we'll say goodbye afterwards. Hey, everybody, this is the Break It Down Show. I'd love it for you to subscribe. All you got to do is hit the button. If you want to help directly, you can go to breakitdownshow.com, hit the PayPal button, and just invent your own subscription. You want access to me, whatever, send me an email, pete@breakitdownshow.com. We've been talking with Sebastian Bae, who's fantastic, my buddy Brad Hutchings, and all his work. You can look back a couple episodes. You'll see a lot of Brad talking about AI. We got something for everybody. Let me know if there's somebody you want to have on the show, and I will talk to you all later. Fellas, I'll be right back to you. Hold on.